The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.
Welcome to Tbilisi and welcome to the show, and thank you for taking our questions. First of all, please tell us what is the purpose of your visit to Tbilisi?
Thank you for inviting me. These days we are here in Tbilisi to present our latest transition report. This is a flagship report of EBRD, and it offers a richness of very useful economic analysis which are characteristic for these unusual times in which we live.
Yes, exactly. First pandemic, now Russia-Ukraine war, and this war has created some opportunities for Georgia, you would probably agree, but should we mistake them for sustainable growth, this double-digit growth that we've had so far?
Yes, this is the right question, whether this is sustainable. It's good that Georgia had excellent growth rate last year, more than 10%. Georgia used the opportunity. Actually, this was a windfall that came to Georgia. It benefited a lot from this inflow of Russian immigrants and capital inflows. But yes, you're right. We should not mix this with sustainable economic growth. This was based on some temporary factors, and that's why we should be quite cautious for the future. For this year, for example, we think that Georgia economic growth will return to some long-term average.
Which is?
Which is around 5%. Georgia showed that it's capable to have growth rate of around 5%, which is excellent result, I would say, to have this in a longer term. And we expect that Georgian economy will return to this growth rate this year and next year, close to 5%, maybe a little bit more. But this is something that Georgia can comfortably achieve.
You probably remember that, for example, Fitch Ratings said that this war had effect of positive shock on Georgia's economy. Then Moody's said that this war worked as a booster for Georgia's economy. What does the transition report of EBRD say about it? And how come that the projections that the government itself had while this war was just starting, they even said that Georgia might lose $2 billion because of this war?
Well, everybody expected a very negative impact from the war of Russia to Ukraine, and we should not undermine the negative implications. Negative implications are there. Maybe they were just temporarily overwhelmed by the positive impact on Georgia and some of other countries in the region. And this is good. This is good that this surprised us all. We were all very pessimistic last year. We expected severe negative impact, not just on Georgia, but it appeared that in short term there were very positive impacts. Nobody expected this, but they were here. However, in long term, these negative implications from this tectonic shift, I would say, with Russia invasion on Ukraine and everything that followed up afterward, Russian economy will suffer a lot of years to come, and we know that Russian economy is the biggest economy in the region. It's a quite important trade partner for many countries in the region, and this will have significant negative implications on longer term. But that means that all countries, and including Georgia, should look for alternatives and how to overcome these negative implications.
Since you mentioned the countries of the region, which countries would you identify also that that benefited from this war economically, of course, as Georgia did?
Armenia benefited, some Central Asian countries, even Azerbaijan, I would say, benefited from other source from high prices of hydrocarbons and great demand for them, but still they benefited last year. And that's why we expect that these were just temporary effects for all these countries, and this year and in the years to come, they will return to some more normal operations.
So what is EBRD's outlook on Georgia's economy and the regional economy going forward?
Yes, in the near future we expect economic growth to return to some long-term averages in all this region, including Georgia. And for long term, it will all depend of policies, but also on general economic development in the world.
Looking at the opportunities for Georgia that we hear, that's the Middle Corridor, that's the Black Sea cable project, that's beginning to appear more real in coming years. This is also the candidate country status that Georgia is aspiring to. I mean, how could Georgia capitalize on these opportunities?
Yes, you mentioned some of the most important factors that could be crucial in the period to come. Middle Corridor is an opportunity. So far in the past it was just considered as alternative corridor to the Northern Corridor and to the Southern Sea Corridor for transportation of goods from Asia to Europe, but now Middle Corridor receives a lot of attention. It all depends how this idea will develop. A lot of investments are needed, but this is a great opportunity because Georgia lies exactly in the center of this Middle Corridor, and it could transform Georgia into a logistical and transport hub, which could be a great opportunity. However, this is a long-term project, a lot of investments are needed, and probably a lot of involvement of international players and large companies is crucial.
Yeah, so what are some of the ways that Georgia can be more integrated into world and European economy?
Georgia is a small and open economy, and as such, it has to be well integrated into the world economy. It has to have high share of trade in its GDP. Georgia, I would say, is already well integrated, but it should be even more. The share of export to GDP should be more than 70%. Actually, this is shown by the most successful countries in Europe, like small Baltic countries who have exceptionally high share of export to GDP. And this is the only way for small economies. So far, Georgia is doing very well in export of services, but not so good in export of goods. And maybe this area, production of goods and export of goods, should be looked more carefully and create conditions to have investments and to have more export from these sectors.
What do you see currently in figures when you're analyzing the economic diversification of Georgia? Is Georgia getting more dependent on Russia's economy?
I would not say that. Actually, looking at foreign trade statistics data, we see that this share of export of Georgia to Russia is quite stable, between 10 and 15% of the total export of Georgia. The largest portion of export goes to EU, then neighboring countries. Actually, neighboring countries, export to Armenia, export to Azerbaijan, are almost equal to export to Russia. So from this point of view, I don't see increased dependence on Russian economy.
Also, some economists have raised arguments that it is Russia that could be getting, Russia's economy could be getting more dependent on Georgia's economy, especially its northern parts. And this might not be as bad considering the fact that there might be some kind of risk of aggression on Russia's side. Is it, does this assumption seem logical to you?
Judging by what we see in the economy, there's some logic in that. We see that many Russian companies, especially in IT sector, but also some international companies that were previously based in Moscow or St. Petersburg, now are moving away from there, and some found their a place in Georgia, in Tbilisi. And this is good for Georgia, because Georgia becomes a center of the region for some of the companies, and certainly more developed Georgian economy and more dependence of the neighboring countries, it's also good for security of Georgia.
Why didn't this double-digit growth, economic growth, prove to be inclusive in Georgia? Why people cannot feel these double-digit numbers on their pockets? Is the main challenge inflation here?
It's interesting observation, and certainly we all want to see more inclusive growth. Judging by data, so far there are not many that we can see. Unfortunately, not many data are available to have deeper insight into this issue. Judging from employment data, I would say that yes, it's true that women are less engaged in Georgian economy, and participation rate of women labor force is significantly lower than male labor force. So obviously there's an issue here, and we should all look for the ways how to increase the participation of women in the Georgian economy, as this could be additional boost for economic growth in Georgia. Judging by wage developments last year, I could see that most of the sectors enjoyed quite good real increase of wages. Not many sectors lagged in this area. So certainly, judging by all this, it's difficult to say whether we had inclusive growth or not, and whether all segments of the population enjoyed the high growth rate of last year. But it's true what you mentioned, that high inflation usually hurts more people with lower income, because larger proportion of their income goes on basic food and utilities. And we know that exactly those prices increased the most last year. And maybe because of that, their living standard was hurt a bit more than living standard of people with higher income, in which budget these items like food and energy are not so high.
So in this context, what you are telling me right now, this policy of Georgia and Georgian government to be open to Russian tourists, to Russian money, was it the right decision in these current circumstances?
Most probably it was, because Georgia just behaved as it should. It received those people who found refuge in Georgia. They're opening businesses here in accordance with Georgian regulation, and certainly they're operating in Georgia according to local laws and regulations. And from this point of view, inflow of this money was very positive for Georgia. And certainly, I would not say that there was another way to deal with this. At the end, accepting all those immigrants from Russia, maybe it could be also a humanitarian issue, because they were escaping Russia not to be mobilized in the war. So if you look at the issue from that point of view, again, Georgia did the right thing.
This is actually argument of the business as well. They are saying that this is their moment to do business with Russia because of the circumstances, and if they are not violating any rules that Georgia's government has, and if they are not violating international sanctions, then what's wrong in doing business with Russia? Again, in current circumstances, considering the war that we have been talking about, is this the right attitude towards doing business?
You know, always you have many aspects of this issue. One aspect is legality and all these legal issues concerning the sanctions. As long as they're obeyed, there's no any issue here. But then there's another issue of, let's say, morality. Whether, Georgia should solidarize with Ukraine and not do business at all with Russia. But on the other side, not doing business at all, it would hurt Georgian citizens. It's a very hard moral dilemma, and certainly in many cases, countries look on the first place at the well-being of their own citizens.
And also looking at the region, what are some of the challenges in the region that might have a spillover effect on Georgia? And do you see, for example, these gas prices, persistent inflation that we have mentioned, shall these be the factors that will be weighing in on economic growth in the region and for Georgia as well?
Certainly, high gas prices and in general energy prices last year had significant impact on inflation in Georgia and also inflation everywhere in the world. Georgia so far dealt very well with inflation, and if we compare inflation in Georgia, it's on the same level as inflation in European Union. So from this point of view, and Georgia has one of the lowest inflation in this region of the world. So from this point of view, Georgia dealt quite well. Central bank did an excellent job. They acted very early, in the early stage of rising prices. And so far, we see that inflation is under control. It's gradually going down. This will not be reduced overnight, but this will be a process everywhere, even in developed economies. Nobody expects that inflation will come to the target immediately. It will take some time, but Georgia is on a good way. And as I said, this is also a good tool to deal with negative impact of inflation on people with lower income, because higher inflation, higher prices are hurting most those that are most vulnerable. And therefore, reducing inflation is also positive.
These immediate measures that the government of Georgia is taking, for example, price caps on medicine, for example, subsidies, employment programs, and so forth. Do you see? Do you think that these are the right steps to mitigate the challenges that you have?
So temporary measures, they could be the right measures, because we saw many countries applied such direct measures because of the extraordinary situation with inflation last year. But certainly they should be only temporary, and they should not be prolonged for too long.
Yes, and my last question, out of these 12 points that Georgia has as the precondition for the EU candidate status, which of them do you think will work for the benefit of Georgia's economy?
Actually, approximation to EU in general would be a great asset for Georgia. And therefore, it's important to work on all of this, because all of them are a condition for Georgia to advance in the EU accession. And we know that example of countries that joined EU earlier, in the process of accession, they enjoyed high level of convergence. So accession to EU is a great opportunity for Georgia to converge in income levels and to converge Georgian economy to the EU economy.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. It was my pleasure.